I'm going to share with you the most helpful metaphors and questions that I use right there in the fire of client conversations and in that high pressure environment of group typing sessions that really brings that aha moment where people go, oh, okay, that's my type. What people don't want is lengthy lists of keywords. They don't want information dumped on them. They want you to bring it to life. That's your job, right? That's if it is your job. Positivity, affirming, uplifting is the way our 2s, our 7s, and our 9s like connecting. If you'd like to gain the insights and the gold aha moments that I've just gained from working with 373 people to help them to discover their type and to give them useful tips. In the last 2 months, I have run 18 sessions for a corporate client. So this is a fantastic case study that has really harvested a bunch of useful information. So if you love the Enneagram, and especially if you love helping other people to work out their Enneagram types and to use the Enneagram as a map for growth, then we're going to do a deep dive today. Join me. My name is Colleen Joy. I'm an MCC ICF Master Certified Coach, and I'm the founder and creator of Inner Life Skills. I'll share with you why I still don't like the typical Enneagram tests and what I have found most useful to do instead, especially if I'm only given 90 minutes to work with a big group. You do want some kind of heads up, some clues to start with to work with the Enneagram typing process, but at the same time, you want to avoid mistyping. I'm going to actually show you in this particular case study the distribution map. So at the end of typing these 373 people, how they were distributed. And I'm going to focus on why I think there wasn't a single type 4 amongst the 373 group. And I'm going to share with you exactly what are the typical common client objections that I've seen echoed in this case study as well as over the last 20 years, and what I do to overcome them, including when people say, this is really a waste of time. In the third part of this video, when I focus on what I've learned about what clients love, what people really are the most interested in, and what they're not interested in. And this is going to be especially relevant if you are bringing the Enneagram to life for people in any capacity. I'm going to share with you the most helpful metaphors and questions that I use right there in the fire of client conversations and in that high pressure environment of group typing sessions that really brings that aha moment where people go, oh, okay, that's my type. And I've really spent probably 20 years refining and testing and improving these to find the most reliable ones that I'm going to share with you. I'll also cover the most common client questions, the things that people tend to ask all the time, and the way I answer it. And finally, how I love finishing off with a 5-minute section on Russ Hudson's harmonic and his approach to the harmonics in relationship building, and how I've compressed his teaching into a wonderful take-home, easy-to-use piece of information that clients really love. So we're going to be focusing on mistyping and a whole bunch of things that I've learned about that, focusing on the case study as a second thing. And finally, what clients love and what they don't love about the Enneagram, and a whole bunch of Q&A information around there. At any point, if you want to pop a comment down to ask particular questions, I'll do my best to answer. Otherwise, it might be a topic for a future video. And speaking of which, if you want to send in a question, there's no such thing as a small question or a big question. Visit innerlifeskills/ask. That's innerlifeskills/ask. And you can send in topic ideas and questions. And once a month, we do a random lucky draw from the folks that send in their questions and topics to win some prizes, including some of our ICF accredited coaching, self-study 101 programs and coaching sessions. The types that I have found the most difficult to type accurately of all the years that I've been working with the Enneagram, as well as in this particular case study, if I had to rank them, I would say for me first, our beautiful sixes are probably the most difficult to type. One, because there are two variants of six. There's the counterphobic expression and the phobic expression, which means there are really two quite distinct different types of sixes. I do have a video deep diving the difference, and of course the difference between counterphobic and 8. And that is one of the big mistypings that I have seen so often. And one of the reasons 6 and counterphobic 6 are often typed as 8s is because most tests, in fact, I haven't found a test that tests for counterphobic. And a lot of the language that is inserted into 8, I actually personally feel belongs in counterphobic 6. And so that is a big one. Also, the nature of a 6 is questioning. And this is what I call a blue pearl. And the blue pearl triad, which is 5, 6, and 7, are quite dominated by the mind. So there's already a natural thinking, analyzing, and of course for our 6s, very much a questioning and questioning of the questions. So because of the nature of the mind of a 6, which is also like a beautiful crystal chandelier where they are looking at things from various angles, and because the mind of the 6 is very much about doubting, then you're going to find that the actual typing process is more challenging. I've also seen all of the blue pearls, so that's 5, 6, and 7, because the nature of the mind is one of dividing and categorizing things into little boxes, splitting things, like the mind divides with language and with the labels of language, left, right, up, down, in, out, for and against. That polarizing function and the dividing, separating function of the blue pearls, what I've seen as a not always true, but as a generalization, is that our blue pearls tend to spot that one word inside of the mix or the description of an Enneagram type, and they tend to chop up a sentence or a description, and if one word doesn't fit, it can throw out the whole mix, instead of really being able to see the Enneagram as a compilation and to see the subtle mixing of words. There tends to be like that one word didn't fit, therefore question the whole type. And so understandably, that causes a lot of back and forward in the typing process. So I would say 6 is number 1 in the most difficult to type. The next one I would say, and that this might be a surprise for you, is actually type 2 on the Enneagram. And of course, the reason type 2, I feel, is quite difficult to type is because our 2s are so focused on others. I always say 2s are singing the you song. Like, how are you? Focus on you. What do you need? And their growth, and it's a real growth path, which means it's difficult, it's challenging, is to learn to sing the me song, which is, of course, their growth path to 4, which is difficult because in the language I use, when a 2's at its lowest expression, it doesn't have access to 4. At its highest expression, it does, but that's not easy. And therefore, what we're doing with the Enneagram is we're asking somebody to focus on me, themselves. And because a 2 is really habitually orientated towards focusing on others, they often struggle to even have emotional vocabulary around themselves, and in particular around wherever there's vulnerability, wherever there's pain, wherever there is struggle, the shadow, the darker side of the personality, our twos particularly struggle to articulate and sometimes even be aware of. And therefore, when you're typing, we've got to look there. We're looking at some of the difficult aspects of the types in order to get a typing. And you all know probably that 2 is classically often called the helper. I personally don't use these classic labels. You'll notice that in any of my Enneagram videos and in the way I train the Enneagram. And it's because these classic labels, I understand they are useful. They have a role to play. They're accelerating the process of understanding. But, folks see the word helper and they see the descriptions of classic 2, and you want to know how many different types then think there are 2s. 7s think they're 2s because they can be naturally very helpful and selfless. 9s can identify with being selfless and helpful and amicable. 6s definitely often type and think there are 2s. And so therefore our 2s are classically mistyped, and 6s are mistyped as 2s, etc. I've even had 8s mistype as 2s because of that growth path. So very high functioning 8s can often also identify strongly with 2 characteristics. So I don't like using these kind of labels because they bias us, they blind us, they're a blind spot making label. And of course, because our 2s are so focused on everybody else and they do struggle to point attention inwards. The other challenge with typing 2s is that in the process of coaching a 2 on the Enneagram and asking them questions, we have to ask questions about why they do certain things, how they feel about certain things, and it becomes really difficult, I've found, for a lot of 2s to express this. Now, a 2 that has worked to open a door to 4 finds it easier, but a reliable tell actually that you are dealing with a 2 on the Enneagram is the difficulty in this conversation. The next type that I find really challenging to type, but it's in order. So first I find 6s, then 2s, and this is 1s. And the reason I find 1s often struggle to discover their type is because 1s often identify with the mind types. So even though a 1 is a gut type, and therefore as a gut type they are have this driver of an instinctive physical reflex that is not intuition. I think all 9 types can be intuitive, but it is a reflex in the body. I call it a pre-verbal body response. So our 1s have that, and it is a driver. But because the primary polarity of a 1 is to be good and not bad, what you have is that the mind gets co-opted, gets resourced, added to the gut instinct, and the mind is looking for the rules, which is a very classic part of the 1's dynamic. In an attempt to be good, now the mind makes this list of right, wrong, morals, standards, rules, and it struggles to see gray. It's like, because the nature of the mind is this polarizing, dividing, what you have now is that gets added to your 1 on the Enneagram. So 1s often feel quite analytical. They can have even some of the anxiety for around being good versus bad. So what you've got to do when you're typing a 1 is sift through that to find still that underneath all that mind noise, all the thinking, all the sort of data checking, analyzing, you've still got a gut instinct. And actually, I have a couple of ways that I do that. When we get to the part of the video where we talk about my metaphors and the questions that I use to separate types, I'll go into pretty much the 1 or 2 most reliable ways I can use to separate out the one from a blue pearl. So the last one that I find really difficult to type, and it's the least difficult, I think, out of this group, is 4 on the Enneagram. And the reason I find 4s difficult to type is, number one, they often really don't like the Enneagram because, after all, our 4s are trying to be unique. They have a drive to being special. They want to be seen in this particular way to avoid the shame of the heart, right? So it's very much a self-worth driven, unconscious perhaps desire. The heart wants an image of specialness, uniqueness. And now the Enneagram is saying you're a 4. So already there is a struggle. There is some kind of struggle with, I don't want to be in that box. And of course, most people have that as an objection, understandably, but for our 4, this is quite a big one. The other thing I often find is that when a 4 is interested in the Enneagram and overcomes that particular objection, the other reason they are difficult to type is that you often get a very strong association with 2. And a lot of 4s I've worked with, especially in my student groups, training Enneagram coaches, because in this particular case study, you're going to see that we don't have a single 4. Okay, I've blown the punchline of wanting to tell you which type was missing in the case study, but there's not a single 4 in this particular case study. I will tell you why later, but and that's because the 4s that I do work with over the years have often thought they were 2s. And there's one particular question that I actually use to separate 4 from 2. I'll give it to you right now, and it's a clue about how I work with realizing I'm working with a 2. And the decider question that I use is, if you've had a really terrible day, a really awful day, say somebody bumped your car, you're feeling unwell, a day that has evoked negative emotions, weakness. At the end of the day, if a loved one, someone you trust, says to you, "How was your day?" What is your response? That's the question I ask. Now, the reason I ask that is because our 4 on the Enneagram can articulate easily their pain, their struggle, their suffering. In fact, part of the dynamic of a 4 is this emotional bandwidth, this huge emotional vocabulary. So our 4's hearts are moving to find that subtle expression of, it's not quite sadness, it's melancholy. It's not, the sky is not blue, it's cyan. Whereas our 2s really struggle to do this. Our 2s minimize. They will say, "I'm fine, I'm great, I'm okay." So that one conversation about a terrible day really helps me to separate out a 2 versus a 4 in the moment. Now, if there are other possible types on the table, if we're also looking at 7 or 6, then we have to take a slightly different approach. But if it's 2 versus 4, that's the question that I find the most helpful. Now, the types I find the easiest to discover, the type to guide to that epiphany moment, are in order of how easy I find it to type. And this, of course, is a personal opinion based on my experience. First of all is 5. Next, I find 8 quite easy to type. Then 7s, then 3s, and finally 9s, because sometimes 9s are tricky to type, I find. But classically, 2 or 3 questions later, 5s for me are much more easy to spot, and the distinguishing factors are pretty clear and obvious. And because of the nature of 5, 8, and 7 in particular, I find they also identify with the characteristics the most smoothly and easily. Now, I do want to make a point about the role of wings, subtypes, and growth paths in mistyping. In case you don't know what wings are, every type on the Enneagram has 2 other types left and right that are called the wings. So for example, a 1 could have a 9 wing or a 2 wing. or both. And now, in my opinion, and it is my opinion, people can have no wings. And I know a lot of folks say you have to have a wing. I've not seen that always be true. I think wings come and go. I think they are circumstantially influenced. I think people acquire wings out of necessity. And I've seen people with one wing, and I've seen people actually accessing both wings. And of course, this is something that rises and falls depending on circumstances. So of course, the wings do influence and impact mistyping. The amount of clients that I've worked with in this particular case study and beyond over the last 20 years that typed, for example, on a classic test as a 2 with a 1 wing, meantime they were 1s with 2 wings, right? So this happens very, very often. So obviously the wings do play a role in mistyping. The next aspect that plays a significant role are the actual growth paths. And in fact, I think the growth path has an even stronger impact on mistyping. So for example, a 9 on the Enneagram, that is a lower functioning 9. So remember that every type has different levels of health. It's just like you would look at an apple tree, and if the apple tree was given everything it needed to grow, it would be flourishing, fruit-bearing, strong and healthy. But if the apple tree was not given what it specifically needs to grow, it would be weak and unhealthy. So it's exactly the same with the Enneagram types. Each type has a growth path, and a low functioning and an unhealthier type looks very different to its higher functioning, higher expression counterpart. So these lines, which of course are the Enneagram itself, the actual diagram, the geometry of the Enneagram, tell you something about the growth path. Now you will see most often little arrows indicating what is classically called integration and disintegration paths. For example, so a 9, the language often is 9 goes to 3 at its highest and goes to 6 at its lowest. And the idea is that, for example, a 9 will access the best of 3 at its highest expression and the worst of 6 at its lowest expression. I do have a whole video on the growth paths. I'll put it in the description for you to go and check out. So I'm not going to do a deep dive here. That deserves its own whole video. But I prefer to teach it slightly differently. In my opinion, a low expression of type has almost, instead of going to, it has doorways. So you think of it as a switch, an electrical switch. So when a 9 is at its lowest expression, it is got a closed door. It cannot access 3. It can only access 6. And that leads to a 9 not being balanced by both of these types. And it beautifully describes the low functioning 9. The low functioning 9, for example, has a lot of 6, a lot of anxiety, a lot of procrastination, where the busy chandelier mind of the 6 is showing up in that heavy gut body focused 9 on the Enneagram. And there's a distinct lack of all 3 characteristics. So there's a lack of being able to finish sentences that start with I want, I feel, I need. This is classic 9, for example. So without going into each and every one of these, because that, as I say, deserves its own tutorial, and I do have a whole video on that, I think you can tell just from this example how easy it is to mistype depending on where you are at. If you're in a particularly low time, you're going through a lot of stress, you might be displaying much more of one of these growth path characteristics than the other. And a week later, this can change. So when people ask me, can your Enneagram type change? I say, not your actual type. Just like an apple tree doesn't turn into an orange tree somewhere along the line, right? This personality pattern is always within you. It's going to change only in terms of its growth when you give it what it needs. So a lot of 9s, for example, may type or think they are 6s. A higher functioning 9 may actually start to identify with quite a bit of 3, but it's still going to be anchored in this red pearl 9. So all of these growth paths, if you look at all of the growth paths, you will see that when folks are identifying, when a 1 is identifying with 4, when a 7 is identifying with 1, when a 2 is identifying with 8, etc., you're going to see, oh, okay, that makes sense. And this is why I feel that tests, it's one of the reasons I feel that tests really don't do the typing process justice. Why I still don't like typical Enneagram tests. Number one, I think the primary reason is because I actually feel someone needs to be educated in the Enneagram to some extent in order to make the decision about whether a test is accurate or not. So most people that claim to have an accurate Enneagram test have asked people exactly at the time that they've done the test. And if you give someone a very big report with a lot of data, they're going to probably find something in it that's accurate. But at least in my experience, give it a few months and help the person to understand all 9 types. And that's when the epiphanies are going to happen, where the person's going to realize, oh, wow, actually, no, that's why I didn't fit completely. That's why there were these, well, that's accurate, but not that. And that's a very natural part of the self-awareness journey of the Enneagram. So I prefer a narrative approach. I prefer a coaching approach where there is a mix of education and coaching, engagement, conversation, so that through the conversation with a group or with an individual, there is a partnering to discover the type. Now, that being said, in this particular case study that I'm going to dive into now, I didn't have the luxury of a 4-hour session with each of the groups that I worked with. I worked with 18 groups in this particular cohort, this rollout over 2 months. As I said, 373 individuals that needed to be typed. And I was given 90 minutes per session, which was almost impossible, bearing in mind that some of the groups were more than 20 people. In fact, there was one group with more than 40, some online and some in person in a boardroom. So what I did is I used a PDF tutorial quiz test clue gathering device that I'd created to at least start the process, so that when folks arrived in the room for the typing session, I had some clues. Now, I knew that some people would go through the PDF and the questionnaire very quickly. Some wouldn't watch the videos to gain the insight in order to answer the questions properly. Others would. So I had to keep this in mind. So even the little quiz tutorial based test that I've made, which is never a cold test on its own, I absolutely know is not accurate, right? However, the clues that it gave me were enough to kickstart the process, because I understand that tests do accelerate, and that's the reason for their appeal. It looks like the quick drive-through version of the Enneagram, which I get because we're busy people and our clients are busy. And so we want to help them not waste time. And the narrative approach, even though I prefer it, the downside of the narrative approach is that it's usually very time expensive. It usually takes a bunch of time to work through. And in fact, over 20 years, I've narrowed it down, or I've squeezed an Enneagram typing session for a group into about 3 or 4 hours. And that's still tight. For an individual client, I think 90 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes is usually about right. So starting with some clues is probably helpful. Now, if you're going to use an Enneagram test, therefore, I would just say use it as a clue gathering device and not as a definitive, that is it. And the problem is that clients that get a report and a test that looks very credible, it's going to often send them down a rabbit hole. And I think there's a 50 to 60% chance of it being accurate. So sometimes it is accurate and you've shortcut the process and wonderful. Now you can get on to the good parts of talking about the Enneagram as a growth path and really helping somebody to unpack how this is useful in their relationships, etc. But if it has mistyped them, you've got the problem of them going down the rabbit hole of a wrong type. And that can take years to undo. In every group that I have trained, there are at least a handful of people, some of which have worked with the Enneagram for years and have actually gone through various schools and various tests that arrive thinking they're one type, and then within a couple of sessions going through this deep dive into the pearls and actually a decluttered approach, they have the epiphany and realize their true type. Here's the case study, a deep dive with all the wonderful nuggets of insight that I was able to harvest. This is in fact the Excel spreadsheet that my office and I worked with and kept adding to every day based on the work we were doing for this rollout. I have obviously removed the clients' names and etc. You can see that what I was doing is starting with some of the clues gathered from the PDF, which were percentages that we populated. It was a little questionnaire with video tutorial tests so that they could hopefully be informed to answer. I also asked each client, based on their little education, that first just simple little videos, to guess which types they related to the most. So what this enabled me to do was to, in fact, start each session with each group, having 2 or 3 types as a clue, as a starting point to accelerate the process. Based on the clues, I created a slide and actually got the client to give me photos of each of the individual team members, which I populated into my diagram with these illustrations, which I had the fun of creating myself many years ago. These, of course, are stock photos, not the real client faces, just to give you an idea. But they would arrive in the room and then they would see their faces, and underneath I would put all the other possibilities. So I would have, for example, 1 and then in brackets 7 and perhaps 3 or whatever the other possible types that had showed up. And this started the conversation, right? And that's what we're going to be going through now. So this is the distribution map of the totals. Out of 373 people in this particular group, have a look, there were more than or approximately 80 people that typed as a 1 on the Enneagram. So that's quite an astonishing group. And you'll see that the runner-up is the 6. Now this axis of 6 and 1 on the Enneagram showed up again and again and again in this particular client rollout. Now it's not to say that that will happen all the time. There's a very specific reason for this, and there's a reason why there was literally a surprise to me and everyone, not a single 4 typed out of these groups. And that's because this particular client, if you can guess the industry that they are in, you will probably get a sense of why this particular distribution showed up. The industry is in the consulting industry. So what most of these people were was either tax consultants, auditors, people that work with numbers, people that are number crunching. There's a lot of policies, procedures involved. This is about compliance. And of course, anything to do with compliance, policies, procedures is going to be playing to your 1 on the Enneagram strengths. And our 6s do tend to really enjoy corporate environments. They feel safe. There's a sense of belonging. Our 6s often want to grow and develop. And so bigger organizations provide career pathing. And of course, a key word for our 6s on the Enneagram is the word support. 6s really want support, especially your phobic 6s. Knowing that this particular case study were in the space of business, finances, with that strong 1-6 axis, you probably will understand why I think there was a lack of 4s. If you go into the world of advertising, any of the creative industries, you're probably going to find a large component of 4s. Not to say that the Enneagram is always going to tell you what career is suited for you. Don't make that mistake. Definitely not. I have seen 4s in banking environments, etc. So it's also got a lot to do with the culture of the organization itself. If you are interested in bringing the Enneagram to life for anyone, in your family, amongst your friends, or in a professional capacity, or as a leader, then you're going to bump into the same objections. So I'm going to share a couple of nuggets of wisdom around what I've learned about this. Now, 20 years ago, the Enneagram was new. It was shiny. It was new. People didn't even know what it meant. And I suppose that's still true in some places in the world. But the reason for the many objections all those years ago was because it was a new thing. The biggest objection was always, I don't want to be put in a box. There can't be 9 kinds of people. This doesn't look very scientific. What's the difference between the Enneagram and Myers-Briggs and all the other kinds of personality systems? Today, because the Enneagram is more popular, because it is more commonly known, because you can find bunches of tests everywhere. So just the informational side of the Enneagram, I think today, at least, as coaches, as facilitators, as practitioners, it's probably a good idea to throttle that back. If I can tell, especially if there's a lot of 8s in the group or a lot of 3s in the group, I started probably around session number 5 or 6, I actually started saying the 8s and the 3s most likely think this is a waste of time. And there would be laughter, recognition, acknowledgement. The moment the conversation starts to bring the Enneagram to life, people start smiling. They start going, oh, wow, that sounds like my daughter, my son, my husband, my wife, my colleague, my partner. The more you can get into engaging in conversation, I found that really helped me with these sessions. And of course, but you need to have a firm, deep, rich understanding of the Enneagram. And you need to be able to simplify it, because what people don't want is lengthy lists of keywords. They don't want information dumped on them. They want you to bring it to life. That's your job, right? That's if it is your job. Okay. So the best way to handle a skeptic is to fully bow to it, to fully allow it in the space, instead of pushing against it, to acknowledge that that is valid, and then to honor that objection. So to make it not a waste of time, to make it as useful as possible, as quickly as possible. So I'm going to share with you the little sound bites. I call them sound bites, the little questions, metaphors, statements for each of the types that really, really help, because this is what they want to know. So it's probably taken me about 20 years to put together this one graphic, this one infographic, to simplify and declutter. And it's also the reason I don't like bringing in subtypes, the 3 instincts, sexual, social, and self-preservation instincts, into the typing, because if you split too many hairs and you make the Enneagram far too complex, you get lost down the rabbit holes. That's a great conversation for a second session, even a third session, to help a client to walk away realizing, gosh, that's my type, so that you can get onto the really beautiful, helpful map for growth, etc. You want to stick to the basics. You want to stick to the most reliable, and I call them the non-negotiables. When somebody is thinking they might be an 8, but they're not sure, okay? So especially it's 8 versus counterphobic, for example, etc. First of all, I'm listening. Is this a red pearl or a blue pearl? Okay, I'm listening. Is there a green pearl? So the pearl is always the foundation. But the key question that I ask to really handle, is this an 8, is I ask, what is your response to betrayal? And then I listen for how they respond. A true pure 8, it is a gut response. It is a reflex. And a low functioning 8 is going to talk about revenge. A high functioning 8 knows they have that in them, but the revenge is the line in the sand, the being dead to them, the cut off. But there is no, it's even a higher functioning 8 struggles with forgiveness, right? So that's, and I could go into it more, and I know there will be some comments and, what about this, Cole? What about that? So just forgive me. Perhaps in another video, we'll go into these in more detail. But right now, I've got to give you that. I've promised you one soundbite. So let's do that. Now, we'll tell you, I have a little bundle for 9 on the Enneagram. I haven't found one definitive soundbite that always works 100%. So I usually throw in 2 and sometimes 3. So I will ask a possible 9 on the Enneagram. If you have an empty diary on a Saturday, like a wonderful empty diary. Now, first of all, 9s are usually excited about an empty diary because they're protecting their energy. The 9 has the lowest energy of all the types, so an empty diary feels like chill time, numbing out time. So I say, if you have an open diary on Saturday and then somebody throws a curveball and invites you and wants you to go somewhere, right? Wants you to go do something. What is your response to that? And is it, and now I find with 9s, I actually have to give them the answer instead of ask, because 9s struggle to finish sentences with I. Right? I feel, I believe. But I ask them, are you more inclined to just go with the flow? In other words, not cause a fuss, not cause conflict by going along to the thing. And then while you're there, you're still undecided about whether you want to be there. That's usually the soundbite that 9s laugh or smile. And if they're amongst colleagues or friends, then everybody goes, yes, that's you. The second part of that is the can't finish sentences with I. Now, 9s don't often even realize they do struggle with this, but I feel, I need, that's often very, very hard for a 9. It's not like a 2 that knows what they want and sacrifices it. A 9 often really does actually not know. And it takes a lot of effort and growth to figure the answers out. My 1 on the Enneagram soundbite is pretty simple, and it's quite reliable. If there is a skew painting on the wall, how do you respond? Our pure 1 on the Enneagram will feel in their bodies that they want to fix it. It's a red pearl gut response to it's not straight. And the way they respond, you feel that red pearl, you feel the grr. Now, obviously, 6s might say they also get bothered by it. They want it to be straight. Maybe even a 4 prefers it straight. Maybe a 9, an 8 will say they like it straight. But the way each of those answers is not going to be quite the same as our 1. Where you get almost that frown and you get this contained red pearl irritation that it needs to be correct. It needs to be fixed. It needs to be straight. So that's my 1 on the Enneagram, decider. My decider question for 2, and this is going to echo similarly for 7, sometimes similarly for 9, and sometimes similarly for 6, but for different reasons. Okay, different reasons entirely. I will ask, if you've had a terrible, terrible, terrible day, what is your way of telling people about it? So your loved one asks, a friend asks, how was your day? What is your answer? Now, a 2 might not have even realized that they do this, but they usually can tell you. They will say, I'm okay, or I'm great, or they'll minimize. So at the most, not my best, a little bit tired, but otherwise fine. Okay? So this kind of response is classically 2. Our 6s might say they will also do that, but the long answer a 6 gives is because it depends on who they're talking to, and if they trust the person, they can offload, and they can get into the gritty, gory details of the way they're really feeling. But the 2, because of this path actually, because of the path to 8, and because of the growth path to 4, which is often denied until 2 grows, you've got a 2 almost being an emotional superhero. So our 2 struggles to articulate weakness and vulnerability. The soundbite I use for our 3 is a little different. It's not so much a scenario. I literally say the theme song for our 3s is Tina Turner's song, Simply the Best. And if the person is a 3, they tend to laugh. If the colleagues are around or the loved ones are around, there's a little bit of a laughter because 3s know this. And then what I will do to support this, if this is not a defining moment, I'll support it by talking about what other 3s have told me. So little lines, and one of my favorite lines, which 3s often relate to, is that they are even trying to outdo their own to-do list. That 3s often relate to, and that's quite a clear indicator. Now, again, especially because 6 can access 3, they can be competitive, they can also be trying to be their best. But what you've got with the 3, of course, is another perhaps one, if they're still not sure, is our 3s really do tend to say yes and not no. Yes, I can. Wanting to prove they can, to not feel ashamed or embarrassed about can't, because can't feels like failure, and failure is deeply mortifying for a 3 because the 3's heart wants to win and be a winner for the image that protects the heart from the shame of losing. And that is different to some of the other types that may relate to some of that. I hope you are getting a lot of insights from this. You're welcome to pop me a chat in the comments and let me know. Our 4 on the Enneagram, the soundbite that I find the most reliable, especially when the person is deciding whether they're off, I find this the most reliable. I talk about the 4's emotions as weather, like weather patterns, where our 4s have these big emotional bandwidths, and they experience their emotions and their feelings as a kind of weather pattern, and they tend to be more in extremes, especially when the 4 is at the lower to moderate expression and not so much at the top highest expression, but they will still know this about themselves. So they don't just do sadness, they can do deep melancholy. They don't just do the shallow end of the emotional ocean. This is deep, intense weather patterns, and the feelings feel like facts for our beautiful 4s. Now, that's not enough usually to confirm the type, but it goes a long way. And it certainly will separate out some of the other types. The other question I might add to that is whether they look for words to express their emotions with sensitivity, that emotional bandwidth, that big emotional vocabulary. So they won't just say, I'm sad, or I'm happy, or I'm frightened. There will tend to be this poetic almost, and it's not always artistic, but there is this looking for the word that describes this intense, deep emotional weather pattern. Now, I do find it relatively easy to type 5s. They are sometimes mistyped with 9s because of both 5s and 9s being on the outside in a way, looking in, tending to be a little bit more separate from where all the attention is, the spotlights are. But likewise, you can have 5s connecting to or relating even to some of 3, even to some of 1, which of course speaks to the shared focus on competencies, etc., which I'll go through at the end of this tutorial. But the decider for me is I tell a little bit of a joke, or I share with them. There was a meme going around, or there was quite a few memes going around during the lockdowns of a couple of years ago. And the memes were a joke about 5s, that 5s have been practicing social distancing their whole lives. And every time I mention that, people laugh, the 5s smile, because your 5s have that need for space to feel secure. This is a blue pill that uses separating from people to feel secure, and they need that spaciousness around them. Of course, once a 5 trusts somebody, and it usually takes quite a long time for them to be willing to share that space, but it is still very, very much that's what it's about. If I do add a second soundbite to the 5 conversation, I will say 5s will study swimming, get 3 PhDs in swimming, and Google and research swimming, but still be reluctant to get in the pool, because that's about the 5's struggle to apply their knowledge and to open a door to 8, which is their growth, which is to engage and to jump in. And that kind of joke slash story often helps the 5 smile, and their colleagues also nod and go, that's definitely you, etc. So there are obviously other pieces to all of this, but I'm giving you these little sound bites. Now, our 6 on the Enneagram, very tricky, I find, to type. For me personally, the hardest to type. I admit maybe it's my blind spot. My Enneagram is a 9, so perhaps it is my own blind spot around this, but I actually don't think so. I suspect it is because of the nature of the 6. The 6 mind, our beautiful 6's mind, are already in a state of paradox, already in a state of questioning and doubting, like a pendulum moving one way or another. So the mind is, can I trust you? Can't I trust you? Is this true? Isn't it true? Should I do this? Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should. That movement of the mind, so it's not so much a soundbite, but I'm looking for that movement of the mind, because it's also, for me, more reliable across both the phobic and the counterphobic expression of 6. The trick, of course, here, or the difficulty, is that our counterphobic often thinks they're 8. The tests that don't have a counterphobic aspect to them, or test questions, will always tend to, not always, but virtually always, test and determine that counterphobics are 8s, which of course isn't true. So those are the challenges. So if I suspect that the person in front of me is a phobic 6, the conversation is different to if I suspect they're counterphobic. If I'm not sure, I need to cover both so that I I can work with that. And very importantly, for me, the counterphobic expression is a continuum in its own right. So our phobic sixes can become counterphobic and move back into phobic. The more they do that, or the more life, quote unquote, lets them down, they feel unsupported, they stop trusting that there is support, the more counterphobic the expression becomes, and a person can become locked more in the counterphobic expression. So that makes it a little bit trickier. So number one, I'm looking for the movement of the mind, and I'm describing the difference between phobic and counterphobic. And now I'm going to give you the metaphor / soundbite that then I use in that context, bearing in mind it usually takes a little bit longer. I use the metaphor of a chair, and this, my Enneagram coaches that I train, they'll tell you, they've heard me teach this for a number of years now. It's as if our six is looking for a quote unquote chair they can trust. And the chair represents reliable, safe support, the ability to just relax and let go and go, you've got my back. I can trust this information. I can trust this relationship. I can trust this person. Your phobic six still believes there are reliable chairs. They can just keep looking. They still will test the chair, make sure it can hold them. Remember, the chair's a metaphor. Your counterphobic expression, the chairs keep breaking. And they've broken so many times that your counterphobic kicks the chair. I don't need chairs. I'm fine on my own. It's fiercely independent instead of a phobic six, which is vacillating between dependent, independent. And your counterphobic goes into what I say like Chuck Norris mode. They go into the fight instead of flight response of the blue pill fear of the six. So when I tell this little story about the chairs and about wanting support, and then I layer in other things like phobic sixes seek feedback, they phone a friend, like what was it, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Phone a friend for feedback. Your counterphobic gives feedback. But I need to layer it on. Often it's not enough just to say that, but it's a really reliable starting point. And it certainly, for me at least, helps the conversation to become more clear and to distinguish six versus counterphobic six, phobic, counterphobic, and six versus other types. And finally, our 7 on the Enneagram. So I'll share the soundbite that I use that actually where I put 6 versus 7 together. And the reason I do this is because a lot of 6s think they're 7s, a lot of 7s think they're 6s. And I just found the contrast really, really helpful. So the soundbite I use is I will say, if there is a river and a little boat, a little kayak, a little boat on the river, our 6 is planning for the worst. So they are contingency planning. They make sure they've got their life jacket. They've got perhaps backup oars. They've got a map. They're a bit anxious about what's around the corner. That's especially your phobic 6. Your counterphobic's a little bit more aggressive about it, proving they're not scared. Where's the rapids? I'm not afraid. I'm going straight there. But they'll still plan. They'll still contingency plan. Your 7 on the Enneagram, and obviously these metaphors I'm exaggerating for effect, right? But it still often lands. They see the boat. Yay, there's a boat. It's been so long. I have been looking forward to the adventure of the river, and our 7s are going to run, jump in the boat. So excited about it. Can't wait to see what's around the corner, the surprises. Realize they don't have oars. That's okay. My hands are oars. I can paddle. The reframing in the positive, the wanting to keep all the options open, the freedom of the adventure and the enthusiastic approach. Usually that story especially to contrast it with sixes. That is a decider for folks, and it often lands enough to help them to realize that that is their type. So other than understanding themselves, understanding their children, understanding their partners, their colleagues, to strengthen their relationships, to really get each other, which is what clients really, really want, what people, I think, really want from the Enneagram. The next big thing is the growth, because the Enneagram's powerful gift is its map for growth. It's not just going to tell us what kind of apple tree we are, so to speak. It's going to tell us what each of our apple trees need to grow. Check out the video that I've made about the growth paths on that. Finally, what were the most common questions that I've heard, not only in this particular case study that I've shared with you, but in the last 20 years? Number one has to be, can't my Enneagram change? I relate to more than one type. Surely I can't just be one type. Now, other Enneagram practitioners will tell you you can be more than one type. In my opinion, that's like saying an apple tree can also be an orange tree, can also be a mango tree. I still feel that your core type is your core type, and I don't even like the word core type. Your pattern is in you. You are not in it. So always we are more than the Enneagram, for sure. But it's like understanding our operating system. And I don't think you can have a mix of a Apple Mac system and a PC operating system. I think that is it. But the level of growth changes. For sure, the wings, I feel, change, can come and go, disappear, appear. And of course, the subtype conversation, the instincts tend to have a dominance. So you're either social, sexual, or self-praise dominant. There's a second and a third. But I've also found that they can weaken and strengthen depending on the environment. And that brings me to the second common question. Which is it, nature or nurture? Is your Enneagram a result of your childhood, of your upbringing, of the experiences you've had? Does that determine and shape your Enneagram? Or are you born your type? Now, I know I'm going to be controversial here, and my 9 on the Enneagram is being brave to be controversial. I always feel the pattern in the background going, you're causing conflict here. In my opinion, taking a stand on this, I really don't think that our environment causes our Enneagram. I think the environment causes how we grow. But I think just like the seed of an apple tree is already an apple tree, I actually think it's innate. I think it's part of, let's say, the soul. Let's say it's part of what's already there. It's already innately there, whether it's because of DNA or whether it's because of the soul. Perhaps that's up for debate, hard to prove, hard to say. My suspicion is that it is something sacred. It is hardwired into us. It's part of our long, sacred journey. And therefore, I feel that we're born with this particular program, with this particular type, and that it's up to the environment as well as our own efforts around growth to do our best to grow to our highest expression. I promised you that I was going to show you my quick way to work with the Russ Hudson's Harmonics as a wonderful cherry on top to the end of a typing session. So Russ Hudson, who's obviously behind the Enneagram Institute and the author of many books and highly respected in the world of the Enneagram, put forward this idea of the harmonics. He does use different labels or names for them that I'm about to use, because I'm all about simplifying and sort of decluttering wherever possible. So our positive harmonic are our 2s, our 7s, and our 9s. What this means is that 2s, 7s, and 9s tend to want some kind of positive, affirming, uplifting, way to bond, connect, and relate to people. So the first thing this positive group wants unconsciously from others is space to connect in a positive frame. If we approach these three with any of the other approaches, it can cause a mismatch, which is why it's so helpful to know this, especially in terms of relating and relationship building, but also for those of us that coach, lead, and guide. If we're trying to guide through our harmonic, we might wonder why we are getting a mismatch. Positivity, affirming, uplifting is the way our 2s, our 7s, and our 9s like connecting. But our 9, the positivity must be felt in the gut. So it's like smooth, easy, going, don't disturb the pond kind of uplifting positivity. Our 2, it's a heart connecting, relating positivity, uplifting relationships and relating chit chat that is fun, positive. And it's our 7, it's the mind positivity. It's the aspirational possibilities that the thought process is going to spin, all the beautiful what ifs. What if we did this? What if we tried that? What are the options available to us? So that's how they each express the same harmonic in order to connect. Our purge group want to offload, right? And that is your 4, your 6, and an 8. Now we've got one of each pearl here, which means that our pearl is influencing the harmonic. Our 8 wants to purge from the gut, share their irritations, share the grumpy red pearl, and they want a space in order to do that, in order to bond. Our 6s want to share their thoughts, their fears, their doubts, their concerns. Our 4s want to share their emotions, their intense feelings. And that's going to be necessary to bond and connect. So if you are working with, or if you are supporting a relationship with someone in a different harmonic, now you're going to get these insights into why we should perhaps think about what other people need instead of only bringing our harmonic to the connection. And finally, we've got our 1, our 3, and our 5. So again, one of each pearl. This is the pragmatic, practical harmonic. So 1s, 3s, and 5s want to join the dots, get practical, move the dial, solve the problem. And that is how they are going to connect, bond, relate. The 5s in a blue pearl mind way, the 3s in a heart relationship, image building way, winning way, and in our 1s in a gut instinct, fix it, make it correct way. But that's a common need amongst 3. And you'll also probably notice that's why people can mistype across their harmonic, or they will identify with certain aspects of a fellow harmonic. So that is my quick and easy way to understand the harmonics. Visit innerlifeskills.com/ask to send in topic ideas, questions, and automatically be entered into a monthly random lucky draw to win coaching sessions with some of our top graduate coaches, our master coaches and professional coaches in the life coaching, Enneagram, executive, and business coaching space. Also stand a chance to win one of our 101 self-study ICF accredited courses, that is Coach 101 or Enneagram 101.